I never imagined that a 4-foot wooden fence around my apple orchard would trigger a war with the Pleasant Valley Homeowners Association. But here I was, staring at the certified letter demanding its immediate removal. My name is Marcus Zimmerman, and I had just spent 3 weekends building that fence to protect my trees from the deer that had been stripping the bark every winter since I moved to this upscale neighborhood in Boulder, Colorado. The letter was signed by Brenda Patterson, the HOA president, a woman in her mid-50s with the kind of haircut that screamed, "I want to speak to your manager," and a disposition to match. I had met her exactly twice since buying my home 6 months ago, both times unpleasant encounters where she informed me about various violations I was apparently committing, from leaving my garage door open for more than 20 minutes while unloading groceries to having the wrong shade of beige on my mailbox post. I read through the letter again, my blood pressure rising with each paragraph. According to the HOA, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, no fencing was permitted in front yards or side yards visible from the street without prior architectural committee approval. My orchard occupied the entire southwest corner of my 2-acre property, which technically included a portion visible from the cul-de-sac. The letter gave me 14 days to remove the fence or face daily fines of $100. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself, crumpling the letter slightly before smoothing it back out. I had bought this property specifically because it had mature fruit trees. The previous owner, an elderly man named Robert who had since moved to Arizona, had lovingly maintained 8 apple trees, 4 pear trees, and 2 cherry trees for over 30 years. When I toured the house, he had shown me photos of the abundant harvests he used to get before the deer population exploded in the area. I grabbed my phone and called my real estate agent, Michelle, who had helped me purchase the property. "Did you know about this fence restriction?" I asked after explaining the situation. "Marcus, I gave you the entire HOA packet during closing. It was like 200 pages, she said apologetically. "I know it's a lot to read through, but technically you acknowledged receiving it." "Yeah, I signed that I received it, but I didn't think I needed a law degree to understand what I could and couldn't do on my own property," I replied, frustration evident in my voice. "The previous owner had a fence around his vegetable garden. I saw it in the listing photos." "That was in the backyard, which isn't visible from the street," Michelle explained. "Look, HOAs can be tough, but they're legally binding. You might want to consult with an attorney if you want to fight this." After hanging up, I spent the next hour researching Colorado HOA laws and reading through the actual covenants for Pleasant Valley Estates. Sure enough, buried in Section 14, subsection C, paragraph 3, was the fence restriction. But I also found something interesting in Section 22, provisions for agricultural or horticultural activities on properties zoned for such use. My property was technically zoned residential agricultural due to its size and the existing orchard. Armed with this information, I decided to attend the next HOA board meeting, scheduled for the following Thursday evening. I spent the intervening days preparing my case, printing out photographs of the deer damage from the previous winter that Robert had emailed me, along with documentation about the orchard's history and the agricultural zoning designation. Thursday arrived, and I walked into the community center where the HOA meetings were held. About 20 residents were scattered throughout the room, most of them looking bored or annoyed at having to be there. Brenda Patterson sat at the head table flanked by 4 other board members, 2 men in their 60s who both wore polo shirts and looked like they spent their weekends golfing, a younger woman in her 30s with a tight bun who kept checking her phone, and an older woman with kind eyes who smiled at me when I entered. "We'll now move to new business," Brenda announced in a clipped tone after they had dispensed with approving the previous meeting's minutes and discussing the community pool's operating hours. "Mr. Zimmerman has requested time to address the board regarding his fence violation." I stood and walked to the front, feeling like I was back in school about to give a presentation. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. As you know, I recently installed a fence around my orchard to protect the fruit trees from deer damage. I understand there are restrictions on fencing, but I believe my situation falls under the agricultural exemption outlined in Section 22 of the covenants." Brenda's expression hardened immediately. There is no agricultural exemption that supersedes the architectural guidelines. Your fence is visible from the street and was installed without approval. The violation stands. If I could just show you the documentation, I began, holding up my folder of photographs and paperwork. We've already reviewed your situation, one of the polo shirt men interrupted. His nameplate read, Gerald Foster, Vice President. The fence needs to come down. If you're concerned about deer, there are approved deer repellent products you can use. I've tried those, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The previous owner tried them for years. They don't work with the deer population we have here. Last winter alone, the damage cost over $2,000 in tree treatments and lost fruit production. The older woman with kind eyes leaned forward. Her nameplate identified her as Dorothy Hayes, Secretary. Could we perhaps approve the fence retroactively through the Architectural Committee, if it serves a legitimate agricultural purpose? The architectural guidelines are clear, Dorothy. Brenda cut her off sharply. We cannot set a precedent of allowing residents to build first and ask permission later. Mr. Zimmerman knew the rules when he purchased his property. The fence must be removed within the original 14-day deadline, which expires this Sunday. That's only 3 days away, I protested. I'm requesting an extension to properly appeal this decision or explore alternative solutions. Motion to deny the extension request, Gerald said immediately. Seconded, the younger woman with the bun added, barely looking up from her phone. Her nameplate read, Jessica Morrison, Treasurer. All in favor? Brenda asked. 4 hands went up. Only Dorothy abstained, looking uncomfortable. The motion passes. Mr. Zimmerman, your fence must be removed by Sunday at midnight, or you will begin accruing fines of $100 per day. This meeting is adjourned. I left the community center feeling defeated and angry. The whole proceeding had been a sham. Brenda had clearly made up her mind before I even walked in the room, and the other board members, except for Dorothy, were nothing more than rubber stamps for whatever Brenda wanted. Over the next 2 days, I consulted with an attorney specializing in HOA disputes. His name was Tom, and after reviewing my case, he gave me the unfortunate news that while the agricultural zoning designation might help in a lawsuit, litigation would take months and cost thousands of dollars. In the meantime, the fines would continue to accumulate, and the HOA had the legal right to enter my property and remove the fence themselves, billing me for the cost. Your best bet is to remove the fence and then apply formally through the Architectural Committee for an alternative solution, Tom advised. Maybe a living fence using approved shrubs or something less visible that still provides deer protection. So that Saturday, I spent 8 miserable hours dismantling the fence I had worked so hard to build. Each post I pulled from the ground felt like a personal defeat. My neighbor to the east, an older gentleman named Frank, who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years, came over to help. Brenda's a real piece of work, isn't she? Frank said as we loaded fence boards into my pickup truck. She's been HOA president for 7 years now, and every year she gets more controlling. Last year she tried to ban basketball hoops in driveways because she said they were unsightly. The vote barely failed. Why doesn't anyone run against her? I asked. Frank laughed bitterly. People have tried. But Brenda has a core group of supporters who always vote for her slate of candidates. Plus, most people don't want to deal with the hassle of being on the board, so the same people keep getting re-elected by default. By Sunday evening, the fence was completely removed, leaving my orchard exposed once again. I stood at my kitchen window that night, looking out at the apple trees silhouetted against the darkening sky, and wondered how long it would take before the deer found them again. I didn't have to wait long. Monday morning, I woke to find fresh deer tracks throughout the orchard and damage to several of the lower branches. By Wednesday, it was clear that multiple deer were visiting nightly, stripping leaves and bark with abandon. I tried motion-activated sprinklers, deer repellent sprays, and even hanging bars of Irish Spring soap from the branches, an old trick Robert had mentioned. Nothing worked. 2 weeks after removing my fence, I drove past the entrance to Pleasant Valley Estates and noticed something new. A large wooden sign announcing that the community had won 3rd place in the Colorado Homeowners Association annual garden competition. Below the main sign was a smaller placard inviting residents and visitors to view the award-winning rose garden maintained by the HOA at the community center grounds. Curious despite my lingering anger, I decided to take a look. I'd never actually walked around the community center grounds before, always just parking and going straight inside for the meeting. Behind the building, I discovered an elaborate formal garden spanning at least half an acre. Manicured hedges formed geometric patterns around beds bursting with roses of every color imaginable. A central fountain featured a bronze statue of a deer, which I found bitterly ironic. Marble benches were strategically placed for viewing, and neat gravel paths wound through the entire display. A large sign at the entrance to the garden read, "Pleasant Valley Estates Rose Garden, maintained by the HOA Beautification Committee. Chairperson, Brenda Patterson. This garden represents the pride and standards of our community." Of course, Brenda was in charge of this too. I had to admit, despite my feelings about the woman, the garden was genuinely impressive. The roses were in full bloom, their colors vibrant and healthy. This was clearly a serious operation, probably costing the HOA thousands of dollars annually in maintenance, water, and landscaping services. As I walked back to my truck, an idea began forming in my mind. It wasn't a kind idea, and I tried to push it away, but it persisted. The rose garden was completely unfenced. The HOA's own architectural guidelines that had forced me to remove my fence would apply equally to them. They couldn't fence their precious roses any more than I could fence my orchard. And deer loved roses. I wrestled with my conscience for several days. What I was thinking about wasn't exactly revenge, but it wasn't exactly noble either. I would simply be allowing nature to take its course. The same deer that were destroying my orchard would naturally be attracted to the rose garden once they discovered it. All I had to do was give them a reason to explore that direction. The more I thought about it, the more justified it seemed. Brenda and her board had shown no sympathy for my legitimate agricultural needs, citing the sanctity of the architectural guidelines and community standards. Well, those same standards left their showcase garden just as vulnerable as my orchard. If they wanted to maintain property values and aesthetics so badly, they should have thought about the deer problem more comprehensively. But I wasn't going to do anything illegal or destructive myself. I wasn't going to damage the garden or break any laws. I was simply going to stop trying so hard to keep the deer on my property. In fact, I was going to make my property less attractive to them and let them find the smorgasbord that was waiting for them at the community center. I spent that weekend researching deer behavior and movement patterns. Deer are creatures of habit, following the same trails and feeding in the same areas unless something disrupts their routine or they find a better food source. The deer currently visiting my orchard approached from the wooded area behind my property, which connected to a greenbelt that ran throughout the neighborhood. That same greenbelt passed within 100 yards of the community center. I purchased wolf urine deer repellent, the most aggressive kind available, and thoroughly doused my orchard with it. The smell was horrendous, like a predator had marked the entire area as its territory. Deer, being prey animals, would instinctively avoid an area that smelled like wolves. I also installed high-frequency ultrasonic repellent devices, even though they had to be approved by the architectural committee. I figured I could afford the fine for a few weeks. Then I did something clever. I took several buckets of apple pomace, the leftover pulp from making cider, and created a trail leading from the greenbelt near my property toward the community center. Not directly onto the HOA property, nothing that could be traced back to me, but along the public greenbelt path. Deer would follow the scent of apples, and once they got close to the community center, they would discover the rose garden on their own. The first night after implementing my plan, I lay awake feeling guilty. Was I really this petty? Was I willing to potentially destroy something beautiful just because the HOA had been unreasonable with me? But then I remembered Brenda's dismissive attitude, the way she had cut off Dorothy when she tried to suggest a compromise, the smug look on Gerald's face as they denied my appeal. And I remembered my beautiful apple trees being stripped of their bark, the damage that would take years to recover from, all because I wasn't allowed to protect my own property. I fell asleep telling myself I was simply leveling the playing field. 3 days passed with no apparent change. The deer seemed to be avoiding my orchard, which was good, but I saw no evidence they had discovered the rose garden. I started to think my plan had failed. Maybe the deer were too habituated to my area to explore elsewhere. Maybe the wolf urine would wear off and they would come back before finding the community center. Then, on Thursday morning, my phone rang. It was Frank, my neighbor who had helped me remove the fence. "Marcus, have you driven past the community center this morning?" he asked, barely containing laughter. "No, why?" "Oh, you need to see this, trust me. Drive over there right now." I got in my truck and headed to the community center, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. As I pulled into the parking lot, I could see a small crowd gathered near the rose garden. I parked and walked over, trying to look casually curious rather than guilty. The rose garden was devastated, not completely destroyed, but significantly damaged. Dozens of rose bushes had been stripped of their blooms and many of their leaves. The ground was torn up from deer hooves, and several of the smaller ornamental shrubs had been trampled. Deer droppings littered the gravel paths. It looked like a herd had spent hours feasting here. Brenda Patterson stood in the middle of the destruction, her face red with fury, yelling at a landscaping crew who looked confused and helpless. Jessica, the treasurer, was taking photographs of the damage, probably for insurance purposes. Gerald was on his phone, apparently arguing with someone about getting emergency repairs done. "This is unacceptable," Brenda's voice carried across the garden. "We just won an award for this garden. The regional competition judges are coming next month for the final round. This cannot happen again." I felt a twinge of guilt seeing the actual destruction, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of vindication. Now, Brenda knew exactly how I felt watching my orchard being destroyed. "What do you think happened?" I asked a woman standing next to me in the crowd. "Deer, obviously," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know why they never put up a fence around this garden. We have deer all over this neighborhood." "Maybe the HOA doesn't allow fences?" I suggested innocently. The woman laughed. "That would be pretty ironic, wouldn't it? Spend all that money on fancy roses and then not protect them." I watched for a few more minutes as Brenda barked orders at everyone around her, then quietly returned to my truck. I felt satisfied, but also nervous. Would they figure out what I had done? Was there any way to trace the apple pomace back to me? Over the next week, I watched the fallout unfold. The HOA held an emergency board meeting to discuss the deer problem. They hired a wildlife expert who recommended several solutions, including motion-activated lights, deer repellent spray, and, most notably, fencing. However, as I had anticipated, the architectural guidelines prevented them from installing a fence without amending the covenants, which required a vote of all homeowners in the community. The irony was not lost on many residents. At the regular monthly HOA meeting the following week, the community center was packed. I attended, sitting in the back row to observe. Dorothy Hayes, the secretary who had tried to help me, raised the issue during open forum. "Madam President, given the recent deer damage to our rose garden, I think we need to reconsider our stance on fencing for agricultural and horticultural purposes. Mr. Zimmerman came to us with the exact same problem weeks ago, and we denied his request. Now we're facing the same issue with community property." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Brenda's face tightened. "The rose garden is a community amenity, Dorothy. It's not the same as an individual homeowner's fruit trees. We're exploring solutions that don't require permanent fencing, such as professional-grade deer deterrent systems, which will cost the HOA thousands of dollars that could be better spent elsewhere," Dorothy pressed. "Meanwhile, Mr. Zimmerman spent his own money building a fence to solve his problem, and we forced him to tear it down. Don't you see the hypocrisy?" "The architectural guidelines exist for a reason," Gerald interjected, coming to Brenda's defense. "They maintain property values and the aesthetic standards that make Pleasant Valley Estates a desirable community." "Then why doesn't that apply to the rose garden?" someone called out from the audience. I recognized the voice as Frank's. "Yeah, if fences are so terrible for property values, why are you considering one now?" another resident added. Brenda slammed her gavel on the table. "We are not considering a permanent fence. We are exploring temporary deterrent measures. The architectural guidelines remain in effect for all private property. Now, can we please move on to the actual agenda items?" But the seed had been planted. Over the next several weeks, more residents began questioning the HOA's heavy-handed enforcement of various rules. A community Facebook group that had previously been limited to announcements and lost pet notices suddenly became a forum for complaints about the board's management. People shared their own stories of unreasonable violations and excessive fines. Meanwhile, the deer continued visiting the rose garden. Brenda's expensive deterrent systems, motion-activated sprinklers, and ultrasonic devices similar to what I had tried on my orchard, had limited success. The deer would simply wait until the sprinklers cycled off or visit sections of the large garden that weren't covered. Every few days, new damage appeared. I had removed the wolf urine from my orchard after 2 weeks, and the deer had returned to my trees, but I found I didn't mind as much anymore. I had started exploring other solutions, including planting deer-resistant shrubs around the perimeter and using protective wrapping on the tree trunks during winter. It wasn't perfect, but I could live with it. 2 months after the initial deer attack on the rose garden, Brenda called another emergency meeting. The regional garden competition judges were coming in 1 week, and the rose garden, despite the landscaping crew's best efforts, was nowhere near its award-winning condition. Large sections remained damaged, with new growth just beginning to fill in where deer had stripped the plants bare. "We need to install temporary fencing immediately," Brenda announced at the meeting, her usual composure fraying at the edges. "Just for the next month, until after the judges complete their evaluation and we can implement a permanent solution." "What kind of permanent solution?" Dorothy asked pointedly. "Because the only real solution is permanent fencing, which violates our own covenants that we just forced Mr. Zimmerman to comply with." Brenda's jaw clenched. "We can amend the covenants to allow fencing for community property while maintaining the restrictions on private property." The room erupted in protests. "That's completely unfair." "Double standard much? Why should the HOA get special privileges?" "I move that we amend the covenants to allow fencing for agricultural and horticultural purposes on all properties, private and community," Dorothy said formally, her voice cutting through the noise. "That's cool. I second that motion," Frank called out from the audience, though as a non-board member, his second didn't technically count. "I second it," said the fourth board member, a man named Richard who had been silent throughout most of the controversy. He was the other polo shirt golfer who usually voted with Brenda, but apparently even his patience had limits. Brenda looked betrayed. "Richard, we discussed this. The temporary fencing for the rose garden is a practical emergency measure." "Then it should be a practical measure for all residents," Richard replied. "Dorothy's right. We can't have one set of rules for us and another for everyone else. That's exactly the kind of thing that gets HOAs sued." Gerald and Jessica exchanged nervous glances. The mention of lawsuits clearly made them uncomfortable. "All in favor of amending the covenants to allow fencing for agricultural and horticultural purposes?" Dorothy asked, taking control of the meeting. 3 hands went up: Dorothy's, Richard's, and surprisingly, Jessica's. "All opposed?" Only Brenda and Gerald raised their hands. "The motion passes 3-2, Dorothy announced. "The amendment will be drafted and sent to all homeowners for a vote in accordance with the governing documents." Brenda sat rigid in her chair, her face pale with anger. After the meeting adjourned, she stormed out without speaking to anyone. Over the next month, things got interesting. The covenant amendment needed approval from 2/3 of homeowners to pass. Brenda launched a campaign against it, sending letters to all residents arguing that allowing fences would degrade property values and destroy the aesthetic character of the neighborhood. She included cherry-picked statistics about home prices in heavily fenced communities versus those with strict architectural controls. But Dorothy, Frank, and a growing group of residents organized a counter-campaign. They pointed out the hypocrisy of the HOA's position, shared stories of reasonable requests denied by the board, and argued that property owners should have the right to protect their investments from wildlife damage. They also noted that the amendment included architectural review requirements, so it wasn't a free-for-all for any type of fencing. I stayed mostly out of the public debate, not wanting to draw attention to myself, but I voted enthusiastically in favor of the amendment when the ballots were distributed. Meanwhile, the regional garden competition judges visited the rose garden. Despite Brenda's last-minute installation of temporary plastic deer netting, which looked terrible and violated the aesthetic standards she supposedly held so dear, the garden had clearly declined significantly since the initial judging. Pleasant Valley Estates was eliminated from the regional finals. Brenda was devastated. I actually felt a little bad for her when I saw her at the community pool one afternoon, sitting alone with a binder full of garden plans, looking defeated. For all her controlling behavior and rigid enforcement of rules, she genuinely cared about the rose garden. It had been her project, her pride and joy, the thing that brought her recognition in the broader HOA community. But my sympathy was limited. She had shown no compassion for my situation when I had asked for help protecting my orchard. She had dismissed my concerns, refused to consider any flexibility, and forced me to remove my fence, knowing it would result in damage to my property. She only cared about the problem when it affected her directly. The covenant amendment vote took 6 weeks to complete, as required by the HOA bylaws. When the results were announced, the amendment passed with 78% approval. Property owners in Pleasant Valley Estates could now install fencing for agricultural or horticultural purposes, subject to architectural committee approval for height, material, and appearance. I immediately submitted an application to reinstall my orchard fence. This time, I went through the proper process, including detailed plans, material specifications, and photos showing how it would look. The architectural committee, now chaired by Dorothy after Brenda resigned from all her HOA positions following the vote, approved it within 2 weeks. As I rebuilt my fence that sunny Saturday in September, Frank came over again to help. "You know, I heard an interesting rumor," Frank said as we dug post holes. "Someone told me they saw you spreading something along the Greenbelt Trail back in June, right before the deer discovered the rose garden." My heart skipped a beat. "Oh yeah? What was I supposedly spreading?" Frank grinned. "Apple pomace," they said. "Thought you were maybe composting or something. Seemed like an odd place to compost, though, away from your property." I focused intently on the post hole I was digging, not meeting his eyes. "Huh, that is odd." "Yeah," Frank chuckled, "real odd. Almost like someone was trying to attract deer away from their orchard and toward something else. But that would be a pretty vindictive thing to do, wouldn't it?" "Pretty vindictive," I agreed. Frank was quiet for a moment, then said, "Between you and me, Marcus, Brenda had that coming. She's made life miserable for half the people in this neighborhood at one time or another. My wife wanted to plant sunflowers a few years back, and Brenda denied it because they weren't on the approved plant list. Sunflowers, the most wholesome, cheerful flower in existence, and Brenda said no because they weren't consistent with the community aesthetic. That's ridiculous. That's Brenda, or was Brenda, I should say. Word is she's moving to a condo in Denver. No HOA where she's going, ironically. I guess she's had enough of community living." I felt a complex mix of emotions hearing that. I hadn't wanted to drive Brenda out of the neighborhood exactly. I just wanted to make a point about the unfairness of the HOA's rules. But I couldn't deny a sense of satisfaction knowing that the person who had made my life difficult was leaving. The fence went up over the next 2 weekends, stronger and better designed than the first one. I used cedar posts treated for ground contact and horizontal boards with spaces between them so it didn't look like a solid wall. It was functional, attractive, and most importantly, approved. The deer stopped bothering my orchard almost immediately. They tested the fence a few times, but deer can't jump 4 feet when it's that close to trees and bushes where they would land. They moved on to easier feeding grounds. Interestingly, they kept visiting the rose garden. The HOA eventually installed proper fencing around it too, a decorative wrought iron style that actually enhanced the formal garden appearance. It cost them nearly $20,000, money that came from a special assessment to all homeowners. I paid my share without complaint, though I did find it amusing that everyone in the neighborhood was paying for Brenda's pet project to be protected from the same deer problem she had dismissed as my personal problem months earlier. The new HOA board, with Dorothy as president, was significantly more reasonable. They streamlined the architectural approval process, eliminated several outdated restrictions, and generally took a more cooperative approach with residents. The community Facebook group shifted from complaints to actual community building, with people organizing social events and sharing gardening tips. My orchard thrived. That fall, I harvested more apples and pears than I knew what to do with. I made cider, baked pies, and gave bags of fruit to all my neighbors. Frank's wife made the best apple crisp I had ever tasted using my honey crisps. Even the cherry trees, which hadn't produced much in years according to Robert, yielded enough for several jars of homemade jam. In October, I got an email from Robert, the previous owner who had moved to Arizona. He had heard through the neighborhood grapevine about the fence controversy and the deer situation with the rose garden. "Marcus, I have to tell you, I got a good laugh out of the whole situation," he wrote. "Brenda Patterson tried to fine me 3 times over the years for various nonsense violations. Once she claimed my apple trees were dropping fruit on the sidewalk and creating a hazardous condition. I had to actually measure the distance from the trees to the sidewalk and prove they were too far away for fruit to roll that far. The woman was insufferable. I'm glad you stood up to her, even if it was in a creative way. Those trees deserved protection, and I'm happy they're finally getting it." I smiled reading his email. It was validating to know that Brenda's unreasonableness wasn't just my experience, that other people had dealt with her petty tyranny for years. A week before Thanksgiving, I was working in my orchard on a cool Saturday afternoon, pruning some of the older branches and clearing fallen leaves, when I noticed someone standing at my fence. It was Brenda. I hadn't seen her in months, not since she had resigned from the HOA board. She looked different somehow, less rigid. She was wearing jeans and a casual sweater instead of her usual crisp slacks and cardigan. Her hair was down rather than in its typical helmet-like style. "Hello, Marcus," she said as I approached the fence. "Brenda, I heard you were moving." "Yes, next week actually. I'm closing on a condo downtown." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to talk to you before I left." I waited, curious where this was going. "Yeah, I owe you an apology," she said, the words clearly difficult for her. "The way I handled your fence request was wrong. You had a legitimate reason for wanting it, and I was so focused on enforcing the rules that I didn't stop to consider whether the rules themselves were fair." I was genuinely surprised. "Thank you for saying that." "I also know you had something to do with the deer finding the rose garden," she continued, looking me directly in the eye. "I don't have proof, and I'm not looking for a confession, but I know, and I know I deserved it." We stood there for a moment in awkward silence. "For what it's worth," Brenda said, "I really did care about this community. The rose garden, the architectural standards, all of it. I wanted Pleasant Valley to be the best neighborhood in Boulder. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that a community is made up of people, not just rules and regulations. I made a lot of people's lives harder than they needed to be, including yours, and I'm sorry. I appreciate you saying that, Brenda, really. And I meant it. Holding on to anger and resentment wasn't going to help anyone." For what it's worth, the rose garden did look beautiful when it was at its peak. You should be proud of what you created, even if it didn't work out the way you planned. She smiled sadly. "Thank you. Enjoy your orchard, Marcus. Those trees are special. Robert loved them, and I can see you do too." After she left, I stood in my orchard for a long time, thinking about the whole situation. I had gotten what I wanted. The fence was up, my trees were protected, and the unfair HOA restrictions had been changed. But the path to get there had involved deception and destruction. I had deliberately led deer to destroy something Brenda cared about, something that brought beauty to the community, all because I felt wronged. Was I proud of what I had done? Not entirely. Would I do it again? Probably not. There might have been better ways to handle the situation, more mature ways. I could have organized the homeowner vote to change the covenants from the beginning, without the intermediate step of sabotaging the rose garden. But I also understood why I had done it. Sometimes people in positions of power don't understand the consequences of their decisions until those consequences affect them personally. Brenda had dismissed my concerns about deer damage because it wasn't her problem. She only took the issue seriously when her rose garden was destroyed. The experience, as destructive as it was, had led to meaningful change in the HOA's approach and had ultimately benefited many residents beyond just me. Thanksgiving that year was special. I hosted a small gathering at my house, inviting Frank and his wife, Dorothy and her husband, and a few other neighbors who had become friends during the fence controversy. I made cider from my apple harvest and roasted vegetables from my garden. We ate on my back patio, overlooking the orchard as the sun set behind the mountains. "This is what community should be," Dorothy said, raising her glass of cider. "Neighbors helping neighbors, sharing the harvest, supporting each other, not just following rules for the sake of following rules." We all raised our glasses and drank to that. As winter approached, I prepared my orchard for the cold months ahead. I wrapped the younger trees in protective sleeves, mulched heavily around the roots, and checked the fence for any weak points that might allow deer to sneak through. I felt a deep satisfaction knowing my trees were safe, that I had fought for them and won, even if the path to victory had been morally complicated. On a cold December evening, I stood at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the snow-covered orchard. The fence, now decorated with a light coating of frost, stood strong and sturdy. In the distance, I could see deer moving through the greenbelt, following their established trails. They approached my property, sniffed at the fence, and moved on, seeking easier food sources elsewhere. I thought about Robert in Arizona, probably missing his Colorado winters and the orchard he had tended for 3 decades. I thought about Brenda in her downtown condo, learning to navigate life outside the structured environment of a managed community. I thought about all the residents in Pleasant Valley Estates who now had a little more freedom to make decisions about their own properties without fear of arbitrary denials from an overreaching HOA. The whole experience had taught me important lessons about property rights, community governance, and the danger of rigid rule enforcement without consideration for individual circumstances. It had also taught me something about myself, about how far I was willing to go when I felt wronged, and whether the satisfaction of revenge was worth the moral compromise it required. In the end, though, as I looked at my protected orchard standing safe against the winter cold, I decided I could live with what I had done. The world wasn't black and white, right and wrong. Sometimes you had to operate in shades of gray, making imperfect choices in imperfect situations. Sometimes fighting back against unfairness required getting your hands a little dirty. The deer had been my unwitting accomplices, simply following their instincts toward an easy meal. They had no concept of property rights, HOA regulations, or human conflicts over fence placement. They were just hungry animals trying to survive, and I had used that to my advantage. In a way, the deer were the most honest participants in the whole situation. They weren't being vindictive or petty or power-hungry. They were just eating roses because roses were available and delicious. Maybe that was the real lesson. Humans make everything so complicated with our rules and hierarchies and need for control. We build systems meant to create order and instead create conflict. We enforce regulations designed to protect property values and instead destroy goodwill and community spirit. We forget that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. If you want to protect something from deer, build a fence. As I watched the deer disappear into the twilight, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would be a good steward of my orchard, producing fruit to share with my community. I would participate in the HOA, helping to ensure it remained reasonable and focused on actual community needs rather than petty enforcement. And I would remember this whole experience whenever I was tempted to be inflexible or dismissive of someone else's legitimate concerns. The fence around my orchard represented more than just protection for my trees. It represented standing up for what was right, even when the system was stacked against you. It represented the importance of questioning authority when authority becomes unreasonable. And yes, it also represented a certain satisfaction in seeing natural consequences play out when those in power refused to see the implications of their decisions. Spring came early that year, with warm winds melting the snow by mid-March. As the weather warmed, my orchard burst into bloom, thousands of white and pink blossoms covering every branch. It was breathtaking, a sea of flowers stretching across my property, protected safely behind the fence that had caused so much controversy. Neighbors stopped by to admire the display, taking photos and asking questions about the different varieties of fruit trees. Frank's grandkids came over to see the blossoms, their faces filled with wonder at the sheer abundance of flowers. Even Dorothy brought the new HOA board members for a tour, using my orchard as an example of why reasonable accommodation of property owners' needs leads to benefits for the entire community. The rose garden at the community center also bloomed that spring, protected behind its new decorative fence. It was still beautiful, though perhaps a bit less magnificent than in its award-winning prime. The new HOA board had redirected some of the maintenance budget to other community needs, like playground equipment and sidewalk repairs, so the rose garden received slightly less intensive care. But it remained a lovely space enjoyed by many residents. I thought it was fitting, actually. The rose garden no longer represented one person's vision of perfection enforced on the entire community. Instead, it was simply one nice feature among many, coexisting with other residents' projects and priorities. My orchard and the rose garden now shared the same protection from deer, neither privileged nor disadvantaged by the HOA's rules. In May, a reporter from the local Boulder newspaper contacted me. She was writing a feature article about HOA disputes and had heard about the Pleasant Valley situation through public records of covenant amendments. She wanted to interview me about my experience. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to rehash the whole controversy publicly. But I eventually agreed, thinking it might help other homeowners facing similar situations with their HOAs. What would you say to other people dealing with unreasonable HOA restrictions? The reporter asked during our interview in my orchard, now covered in small green apples beginning their summer growth. I thought carefully before answering. First, try to work within the system. Document everything, present your case professionally, and hope for reasonable people on the other side. But if that doesn't work, don't be afraid to challenge unfair rules. Organize with your neighbors, vote for board members who will represent homeowners' interests, and push for covenant changes when necessary. HOAs are supposed to serve the community, not rule over it. Did you ever consider just accepting the HOA's decision and finding a different solution? She asked. Mom, of course. But my orchard wasn't just a hobby or a luxury. It's a productive agricultural asset that came with the property. Asking me to leave it unprotected from wildlife was like asking someone with a swimming pool to not maintain it, or someone with a historic home to let it deteriorate. At some point, you have to stand up for your property rights. The article ran in June with the headline, "How One Boulder Homeowner Fought His HOA and Won." It was generally fair and balanced, interviewing Dorothy about the HOA's perspective, as well as including comments from other residents. It didn't mention anything about the apple pomace trail or my role in directing the deer to the rose garden. That remained my secret, shared only with Frank's knowing glances and occasional amused comments. The article sparked some interest in the local community, and I received several calls and emails from other homeowners dealing with HOA issues. I offered what advice I could, mostly encouraging people to organize, document their cases, and push for reasonable governance. A few people asked if I would consider running for the board of my own HOA, but I declined. I had no desire for that kind of responsibility or involvement. I just wanted to tend my orchard in peace. By midsummer, the apples were growing large and healthy, unbothered by deer or any other pests. I had learned from Robert's notes and online resources about proper pruning, thinning, and organic pest management. The investment of time and effort was paying off with what looked to be an exceptional harvest. In August, I got an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from the Colorado Homeowners Association, the same organization that had run the garden competition. They were introducing a new award category for sustainable residential agriculture and wanted to nominate my orchard for the inaugural recognition. Apparently, someone had seen the newspaper article and brought it to their attention. I found this deeply ironic. The same type of organization whose local chapter had forced me to remove my orchard fence was now wanting to celebrate my orchard as an example of good homesteading practices. But I accepted the nomination, thinking it might bring more attention to the importance of supporting, rather than restricting, residential agriculture. The evaluation process was much less formal than the rose garden competition had been. A representative came out in September, took photos, asked questions about my sustainable practices in fruit production, and commented favorably on the wildlife-resistant fencing. A month later, I received a certificate in the mail and a small plaque recognizing my orchard as a model of sustainable residential food production. I hung the plaque on my fence at the orchard entrance, not out of ego, but as a quiet reminder of what the whole struggle had been about. This orchard, these trees, this fence that had caused so much conflict, they represented something valuable and worth protecting. The fall harvest that year was extraordinary. I picked bushels of apples, pears, and cherries, more than I had imagined possible. I gave away bags of fruit to everyone I knew, and still had enough to make cider, sauce, and preserves that lasted through the winter. The investment in the property, both financial and emotional, had been worth it. As I pressed apples for cider in my garage one October afternoon, Frank stopped by with a six-pack of beer. "Thought you could use a break from all that pressing," he said, handing me a bottle. We sat on my patio drinking beer and watching the afternoon light fade over the orchard. "You ever feel bad about what happened to the rose garden?" Frank asked casually. I'd been expecting this question for months. "Sometimes," I admitted. "It was beautiful, and a lot of work went into it, but I also think it was necessary. Brenda needed to understand what it felt like to have something you cared about damaged, because someone else wouldn't let you protect it." "Fair enough," Frank said. "For what it's worth, I think the new HOA board is the best thing that's happened to this neighborhood in years. People actually enjoy living here now instead of constantly worrying about violations." "That's the real victory," I agreed. "Not my fence, not the rose garden getting eaten, but the community becoming more reasonable and livable for everyone." As winter approached again, I prepared my orchard with confidence, knowing the fence would keep my trees safe through the cold months. I had learned so much in the past year and a half, not just about orchards and deer and HOA law, but about standing up for yourself, about the complex ethics of fighting back when you're treated unfairly, and about building real community rather than just enforcing rules. The deer still moved through the neighborhood on their established paths, and sometimes in the early morning I would see them near my fence, testing it occasionally, but mostly just passing through on their way to wherever deer go. I bore them no ill will. They were just being deer, doing what deer do. They had been my instruments, but not my enemies. If I saw Brenda now, I thought I would probably wave and wish her well. She had apologized, which took courage, and she had learned from the experience, which took wisdom. We had both been changed by the conflict, hopefully for the better. On Christmas Eve, after a light snowfall had dusted the neighborhood in white, I walked through my orchard checking on the trees. Everything was secure, healthy, and safe for the winter. I stood there in the quiet, listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood preparing for the holiday, and felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude. This orchard, this fence, this small piece of land had become more than just property to me. It represented home in the deepest sense, a place I had fought for and earned the right to steward. The struggle with the HOA had been frustrating and sometimes ugly, but it had also been necessary and ultimately worthwhile. As I walked back toward my house, I took one last look at the orchard standing strong behind its protective fence. The trees were dormant now, resting and gathering strength for the spring bloom. But I knew that, come April, they would burst back to life, covered in blossoms and promise, ready to produce another harvest. And when that happened, when my orchard bloomed and bore fruit under the protection of the fence I had fought so hard to build and rebuild, I would remember the whole journey that had brought me here. The frustration and anger, the planning and execution, the deer and the roses, the conflict and resolution, and finally, the peace that comes from standing up for what is right and seeing it through to the end. The lights were on in my house, warm and welcoming against the cold December night. Inside, I had apple cider warming on the stove and a fire ready to light in the fireplace. I had neighbors to call friends, an orchard to call my own, and the satisfaction of knowing I had made my corner of the world a little bit better, if not always through the most straightforward means. As I reached my back door and turned for one final look at the orchard, I saw a deer standing at the fence, silhouetted against the snow. It looked at me for a long moment, then turned and bounded away into the darkness, heading toward the greenbelt and whatever feeding grounds it would find tonight. I smiled and went inside, closing the door on the cold and the past, ready for whatever the future would bring.